So from the Fiesta Royal Hotel in Accra, Ghana, welcome to the launch of Afrobarometer's flagship report on citizens' engagement. That was not bad. All right. Thank you very much. So we gather here in Accra, Ghana for the launch of a very important report which gauges the behavior of Africans across many countries. The Afrobarometer series have become the flagship for the continent for the quarter of a century. And Prof. Robert Mathis. All right. We are also very happy to have our board members and the great board chair, Amina Oyagbola, is here with us. Amina, thank you. It's good to see you again. We're privileged to also have on the board Amal Mustafa Medani. Peter Lewis is also a board member, I suppose he's here or hereabouts. Peter Lewis. Well, since we are applauding, let's just do it for him as well. Lara Taylor Pierce. Okay. Ambassador Nozifo January Badil. Wow. Lots of things are happening there. There are dates, there are names, there are times. Bless you. Fauzia Ali is also a board member. And last but not least, Natasha Kimani. So we'd like to now bring up Mr. Asunka to officially welcome us to the launch of this very important African Insights 2025. Please welcome him.
Thank you so much, Bernard. This is one of the reasons why we got Bernard to facilitate this. He'll keep you laughing all day long. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Before we start, we would like to observe a minute of silence, and I'll tell you why. So Afrobarometer is organized as 3 big institutions that anchor the work in the various regions. So we have Ghana, anchored by the Center for Democratic Development. And then in Southern Africa, we have the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation based in Cape Town. And then in the East Africa region, we have the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Nairobi. Unfortunately, just recently, we lost our core partner director, Mr. Jan Hofmeyer. And so I would like us, for those who can stand, let's just give him a 1-minute silence. All right, thank you all so much, and may his soul rest in peace. And as we speak, of course, there's a memorial that is currently ongoing. We did join it briefly, but we do want to acknowledge his big contributions to Afrobarometer's work for many years. For those who knew Jan was a gentle soul. He was a big pillar for Afrobarometer in the Southern Africa region. And so we do mourn him, but we also want to dedicate this launch of the report to him in his giving his contributions to Afrobarometer's work. So with that, Excellencies, distinguished guests, partners, colleagues, and friends from all around the world, a big warm welcome to the launch of Afrobarometer's 2nd edition of our flagship report. Around this time last year, we launched the maiden flagship report, which focused on democracy and governance. In that report, we tried to trace Africa's democratic trajectory since 1999, because Afrobarometer started our surveys in 1999, and we've been 25 plus years running. And so last year we did that, but it coincided with our 25th anniversary, which was also a time that we took a pause to also celebrate the co-founders of Afrobarometer, the three folks that Bernard just mentioned, so Professor Jima, Professor Bratton, and Professor Mattis, who co-founded Afrobarometer sometime in 1998, and it came to life in 1999, and has since expanded from the 12 countries we covered in 1999 now into almost 40 countries to date. So Afrobarometer's flagship report, we dub it African Insights, and that is largely because this is an annual series of publications that we ensure that we get deeper into topics that are of continental policy relevance to ensure that citizen voice is part of the conversations on policy issues that are of importance on the continent and globally. And as I said, last year we did trace Africa's democratic trajectory. At this point, the current report, 2025 African Insights, builds on that trajectory. But this time we are turning the lens a little bit. The last time we looked at democratic evolution. This time we are turning the lens on citizens to see how citizens are engaging and driving democratic development forward. Fortunately for Afrobarometer, we do have a wealth of data on civic engagement and civic participation across the continent, and this dates back to 1999 when we started this project. Asking citizens about the extent of engagement has been part of Afrobarometer's surveys. Of course, the entire project was conceived on that as Africa became more and more democratic in the late 1980s, early 1990s, how to ensure that citizen voice is part of the democratic process, because democracy thrives and citizens are engaged and fully involved in the processes. And so Afrobarometer has continued to give citizens a voice in the process of that, so that Africa's democracy would be anchored in the realities and perspective of African citizens. So in this particular report, as Bernard mentioned, it's a pretty long report, but maybe short for many others. We examined four key dimensions of participation or engagement. The first is the electoral component, so electoral participation. We also look at collective action. I think we all know the value of collective action and how that can deliver results, especially when it comes to holding governments accountable. We have looked at contacting leaders, the extent to which or the frequency with which Africans engage their leaders. And then we also look at activism, especially focusing on protests, and we've seen this happen across the continent, and especially in talking of Kenya or talking of Togo and other places, we've seen a popular uprising of citizens. So we try to also shed some light on that component. The data do show that Africans engage in multiple ways. So all the different ways that we've measured civic activism and political participation, we've used 10 indicators to measure that. And we see that Africans broadly participate in several of these engagement activities. And of course, we also find that when democracy delivers well, it actually encourages citizens to be more engaged. So when elections are seen to be clean, citizens are more likely to be part of the process. When they think that their governments are accountable, they are more likely to engage more. But of course, in some cases, citizens, especially when it comes to protests, we do know that when things don't go well, people also hit the streets. So with that, of course, my colleague, Dr. Lekalake, would soon share details of the findings from the report with all of you. But as we said, we are streaming live on various platforms. If you want to be careful what you do here, that's totally okay. I know everybody wants to appear prim and proper on TV, so we are all on TV now, so just be mindful of that. I would like to acknowledge and applaud our national partners across the continent in about 30 plus countries with whom we have worked with diligently over the past several years, and they continue to produce this data. They are the bedrocks of Afrobarometer. They make it what it is, because in every country we have an institutional partner that leads the surveys and delivers the data. And so we're sitting here to reflect on some of the findings from the data that they have collected. So I wanted to applaud them for that. I also want to acknowledge and thank the analysis and publications team. They worked really diligently, the internal team that anchored the production of this report. It took a lot of time and time investment and effort to get it all together. So I'm really grateful to the Analysis Publications team for the work that they did in producing this report in record time. So thanks, Dr. Logan and your team, for all the hard work you did. And to our logistics team, and especially the communications team and logistics teams who worked hard to make sure that this event is publicized as widely as possible, but also making sure that those who needed to travel got here well. At least the few people I have interviewed regarding their travel, it looks like it has been flawless for most people. So really grateful to the logistics and communications team for all the things that they do behind the scenes to make sure that everybody got here very well. Thank you all so much. All right, we're also grateful to our board of directors here, and of course, Bernard Avle identified our new board chair, Amina Yogbla, who took over the chairship from Professor Jim Abwedi in April this year, and we have benefited from the wisdom and counsel of the Afrobarometer board, so we're thankful to you for all that you do and keeping us in our on our toes to continue to deliver on to our commitment to amplifying citizen voice in public policy making. Also grateful to our International Advisory Council for all that they do in terms of their strategic advice for Afrobarometer. We are grateful to them as well. And finally, to our moderator, Mr. Bernard Avle, is one of the ace journalists in Ghana. And if you haven't heard about him, maybe Citi FM, Citi News, you would probably catch him live either tonight or if you're staying longer tomorrow, you can catch him live. Of course, to our speakers and panelists, we are really grateful that you accepted this. We have panelists from Ghana, from Sierra Leone, from Togo, from South Africa, and so we're going to have a robust discussion of the findings from this report, but also a reflection of their own experiences in the various ways that they engage with citizens and the way they mobilize citizens for different activities. So looking forward to that conversation. And to all distinguished participants present here and all those watching us online on CNBC and other platforms, we are grateful that you have been able to join us. So just to note that it is not just the people in this room, but we have many people around the globe who are watching this event. So once again, a big warm welcome to all of you, and I'm really looking forward to this engagement. And I'll turn you back to our able facilitator to continue the program. Thank you all so much for the attention.
Thank you, Joseph. That was nice. Thank you. I think it deserves another one. Joseph, well done. Wonderful. And so, as Joseph hinted, we have a presentation coming up next, and then we have a panel discussion, and then there are a few more speeches. And this is a very interesting time to launch this report in Ghana because this past 2 weeks on my radio show and other radio shows, there's been agitation over the quality of roads. And as I speak to you, the Minister of Roads is holding a press conference, partly in response to citizens who live on a major road corridor. It's called the Pokwase in Sawam Road, takes you to Kumasi. So because of whatever reason, contractor has not been paid and the road has deteriorated. And they say they have almost 2,000 people on a WhatsApp group, and they're planning a demonstration for Saturday. So yesterday, the president was addressing the Council of State and says he's directing that the money made available be paid to road contractors. He's trying to avert a demonstration. So you can see a lot of things going on. These are citizens who are upset with the quality of the road. They've mobilized on WhatsApp. They've asked the police to give them permit to protest. And it's looking very interesting. And even though they've not directly spoken to the president, using the media, the president is responding. So if you needed a good case study of these four things, whether it's voting or the whole idea of contacting your leaders or activism, I think we have a nice case study going around. And if you stay here long enough, you may see a protest on Saturday. So that's one. So I'm looking forward to Rorisang's presentation on 3 levels to see what else is happening that I can glean from the report. And also, how do we compare to other parts of the continent? We follow news in Kenya, stuff happening there, right? So is Ghana still this haven? We like to think we are very active, but we don't protest much. How different is Ghana from, say, Lesotho or Nigeria or wherever? I'll be looking out for that. And I also be looking out for whether as a continent our behavior can be compared to, say, Latin America, Europe, or whatever. So those are my personal sort of expectations. It would be nice to have yours so that it's easier for the panel, right? Because you see a lot of things, but I'm picking the parts that I feel are useful. Before I bring her in, let me just mention that we're very privileged to have a strong panel. I would like to mention the name of the panelists just for acknowledgement. I'll properly introduce them before I bring them up. So the Minister of Technical and Higher Education for Sierra Leone is here, Hajia. I don't know if it's Hajia or it's Hajia, just to be sure. Is it Hajia or Hajia? Hajia. Yeah, so there's a yeah. So Hajia Ramatulai Wuri. Did I get that right? Thank you, Hajia. Good to have you. We have the Chief Electoral Officer for the Electoral Commission of South Africa, C. Mamabolo. Sai. Okay, thank you. We have our own Professor of Communication and Board Chair, CDD Ghana, Professor Audrey Gajepo. And we also have the Director of Katutu Civil Rights Center, Farida Bemba Naburema. Farida? Wonderful. So there will be slicing and dicing more of what my next speaker is about to do. So without wasting further time, let's welcome Senior Analyst and Methodologist for Afrobarometer. That's a big job. Wow. Senior Analyst and Methodologist, Rorisang Lekalake. Did I get that right? Lekalake. I love it. Rorisang, please come up and blow our minds.
Thank you so much, Bernard, for that rousing introduction. And good morning to everyone. And thank you so much for being with us today. It's my distinct pleasure to present highlights from this year's flagship report. It was very much a team effort. So I only am one small part of all the people who brought this to life, including, of course, all our national partners who make all of our analysis possible. So to start off with, for anyone who isn't already a friend of Afrobarometer, I'm going to just very briefly introduce the organization, give an update on our achievements, and explain the methodology very, very briefly. So what is Afrobarometer? For anyone who doesn't know, Afrobarometer is a Pan-African and non-partisan survey research network, and our goal is to give citizens a voice by providing reliable data on African experiences and on different issues, including democracy and governance, which is kind of our bread and butter, and also the quality of life. We're currently in the tail end of round 10 surveys. So we've been doing surveys since 1999, as Dr. Sunka said, and we expect to complete them in 38 countries later this month. And that will mean that Afrobarometer has collectively conducted nearly 300 surveys with more than 440,000 individual interviews conducted across 45 African countries. So very much a group effort that we do with our national partners to achieve these amazing results. And as you can see from this map, Afrobarometer has a wide coverage throughout the African continent. I think it's safe to say that our goal is to cover every single country in Africa eventually, and we're quite a ways there. So this map shows not only our coverage, but how it has expanded over time. So we started with 12 countries in 1999, which are represented by red, and over time we've added more and more countries, including the countries that we've added in the past 2 years, which are represented in green. So in terms of our methodology, Afrobarometer conducts nationally representative samples of adult citizens, which we consider to be those aged 18 or older in the different countries that we work with. We do face-to-face interviews in the language of the respondent's choice, because we believe it's important to give our respondents the opportunity to voice their concerns in their mother tongue and in the language they feel most comfortable in. We have a standard questionnaire which allows us to make comparisons across countries and across time, as you'll see in the results that I present today. And we have sample sizes of 1,200 to 2,400 respondents. And I won't go into the details of how and why it yields us these representative results, but these sample sizes allow us to say something meaningful about what Africans in all of these countries have to say, and their attitudes and their behaviors. Okay. So today we're here to launch the results of our latest flagship report, entitled Citizen Engagement, Citizen Power, Africans Claim the Promise of Democracy. So it is a very long, as was mentioned, report with a lot of really rich insights. So I will only be able to really scratch the surface of all the information that we have. But what I'll do for this presentation to give a bit of background on how and why we made some of the choices we did, I will start by talking through our approach towards the topic and some of the key findings before presenting the results in detail. There really are results. There is something there. This is just a tech issue. Okay, so I think while it's loading, let me just start talking you through. I guess the first question we might ask is, why this topic? Why citizen engagement? Even though, of course, Afrobarometer, as I mentioned, democracy and governance is our cornerstone, it's our bedrock. But why focus on citizen engagement in particular? And the first reason we chose to do so is that citizen engagement, of course, is a cornerstone of democratic governance, and it is empowering. It empowers citizens to shape the government agenda on one hand, and also policy outcomes. We also believe that citizen engagement matters by allowing citizens to firstly express their views to their leaders, their needs and their preferences. It also gives them channels with which to demand accountability from leaders and transparency from governments. Thank you, Bernard. And it also allows citizens channels through which they can increase the effectiveness of government policies and policy outcomes by giving a direct access and direct grassroots level feedback to leaders. We also chose this topic, as Dr. Asunko mentioned, because we have a wealth of data on citizen engagement. We've been measuring citizen participation in many different realms since our very first round of data. And although we'll focus today and in this report on the 39 countries included in round 9, we also have data going back in the report about 10 years in 30 countries. And of course, moving forward, as I mentioned, we've been doing around 10 surveys. We'll also be able to provide updates to what these trends look like. So how did we measure citizen engagement? As was mentioned earlier, we used 10 different indicators that were grouped into 4 different groups. So I'll just give a very brief idea of what exactly was asked so you can as I talk through the results, have that in the back of your mind. So firstly, we started with electoral participation, which of course is a cornerstone of democracy. So the first question we looked at was whether citizens voted in the last national election. And then secondly, we also looked at whether citizens felt close to any particular political party in their country. And then we also had 3 measures of collective action. So engagement modes by which citizens act with others to achieve an outcome, a desired outcome. The first is discussion of politics with one's family or friends. The second we looked at is whether our respondents had attended a community meeting in the previous year. And we also asked them whether they had joined together with others to raise an issue that was important to themselves or to their community. The third group of variables that we looked at was contact with political leaders. So again, this is an area where we have a wealth of different data over time. And in this particular report, we chose to focus on 4. The first is contact with local government councillors, and then secondly, contact with members of parliament. We also looked at contact with party officials, and then lastly, traditional leaders, as they also continue to play a vital role in politics on the continent. And then lastly, as was mentioned earlier, we looked at a key measure of activism, namely citizen participation in protest or demonstration in the previous year. And so, what did we find? So firstly, we wanted to look at the scope of citizen engagement. So what does it look like across country? And what we found is that on average, across the 39 countries that we surveyed in, voting is the predominant form of citizen engagement on the continent. So 72% of our respondents said that they had voted in the last election. And we found that protesting is the least common, with about 9% saying that they had engaged. In addition to that, we found that almost all citizens had engaged in at least one of our 10 measures of participation. And then lastly, when looking at trends across time, across the 30 countries in which we've been surveying for the last decade, we found that participation levels are rising for contact with political leaders. They're holding steady for voting and for protesting, but we found that they're declining for measures of civic of collective action, such as discussion with others, attending community meetings, and raising issues. And the largest decline we found actually was for party affiliation. So large drops in the proportion of Africans who say that they feel close to a political party. The second key question we looked at was who participates on the continent. And what we found is that young people, so Africans aged 18 to 35 years, are less engaged than their older counterparts on most indicators, but protest was the exception. So young Africans are more likely to protest. In addition, we found that poorer citizens and those with no formal education are more active. So they're more likely to engage in quite a number of different ways, including saying that they identify with political parties, that they attend community meetings, and that they can contact traditional leaders. And then lastly, we also wanted to examine what drives citizen engagement at a country level. And now we have caught up with our slides. And so we've examined 3 different potential drivers of engagement. The first is socioeconomic conditions. And what we found there is that need fosters engagement. So what I mean by that is that participation is higher in countries that have lower levels of economic well-being, which also matches what we found when we looked at poverty level at the individual level. And this is notable because it goes contrary to what has been found in most advanced democracies, global north democracies, however we want to call them, where in those contexts, it's actually wealthier citizens who are more likely to engage. So Africans are different in that respect. We also found that government responsiveness promotes engagement. So when citizens feel that their leaders, and particularly local government councillors, are likely to listen to them and to respond to their needs, we find that citizens are more likely to contact them, to engage with them, and to actually engage in other forms of participation as well. Thirdly, as Joe mentioned earlier, we also find that more democracy means more engagement. So when democratic delivery is seen as being effective, we find that citizens in those countries have higher rates of electoral participation and lower rates of protest. So I think very important insights for those governments who are slightly afraid of their citizens protesting, because it shows that if they deliver, then that's less likely to happen because citizens channel their needs and frustrations through the voting booth. Next slide, please. So firstly, I'm going to show visually some of the information that I mentioned earlier through charts. Next slide, please. So first, with the overview of political and civic engagement. Next chart, please. I'm going to start by walking us through our findings on electoral participation and collective action. So what this chart shows is our 5 indicators on these 2 measures of citizen engagement. So I have in green are 2 indicators of electoral participation, whilst the purple shows our collective action measures. So as I mentioned earlier, what we find is that voting is the most prevalent or most common form of participation at 72%. This is followed, at least in this group, of indicators of participation by discussion in politics, where around 6 in 10 Africans discuss politics with family and friends on a regular basis. We also find that just under half attended a community meeting in the past year, and just lower than that, at 42% of citizens joined with others to raise an issue. And then at the tail end of these measures, we have 41% of citizens saying that they feel close to a political party in their country. Next slide, please. So in addition to that, we wanted to look at what these trends look like over time. And what we found is that all of them have declined over time, at least in the last decade. So this is for 30 countries that we've been surveying continuously since 2011, 2013. So all of them, we've seen a decline, but with a lot of variation in how much that has happened. So for instance, we see a 6 percentage point drop for voting, which is fairly modest, whilst, as I mentioned earlier, feeling close to a political party, which is in yellow, has dropped by 14 percentage points, so a much bigger drop. Next slide, please. And then this chart gives you an idea of what that looks like at the country level for party affiliation. So for instance, we find that in Morocco, we actually have a modest increase in reported party affiliation over the last decade, whilst on the other hand, most of the countries are actually in the negative. So in Burkina Faso, for instance, we saw a 45 percentage point drop in this measure, which was followed by Sudan and Mozambique. And then I'll also highlight South Africa, since we have an esteemed panelist, where we saw a 24 percentage point drop, excuse me. Next slide, please. And then secondly, as I mentioned, we also wanted to understand how citizens engage directly with their leaders. So this gives us the proportion of citizens who contact leaders or contacted leaders in the past year. So we see that direct engagement with leaders is highest for traditional leaders at 37%, and this is followed by local government councillors, party officials, and then members of parliament are more distant when it comes to the citizenry, as only 15% of citizens contacted their MP. Next, please. once again, looking at the overtime trends in this contact, what we see is, in contrast to the last chart I showed you, here we're seeing increases in contact. So we're seeing increases in engagement. So citizens feeling more comfortable, more free to contact their leaders directly. So the largest gain we've seen is in terms of contact with political party officials, which is seen in the red, which has increased by 6 percentage points. And then this is followed by contact with traditional leaders, local government councillors, and then MPs have seen the most modest increase at 2 percentage points. Next, please. And then once again, if we break this down, and I wanted to focus on local government councillors in particular, given that finding that I mentioned about the importance of their responsiveness, what we see here is, once again, quite a bit of variation in how change looks over time on this measure. So we see quite large gains, for example, in West Africa, namely Nigeria, Niger, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, and Togo, and even in South Africa as well. And then where more citizens are contacting their councillors, and then on the other side of the coin, we have drops in countries like Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, and Botswana. Next, please. And then lastly, we have our measure of protest participation, which we've also been tracking over time. And so what we found here is that we've seen quite a lot of change. So as this chart shows, there was definitely an uptick in citizen engagement and protests between 2014 and 2019. So our COVID round, as we often call it, going up from 9% to 16% of citizens who were engaging in demonstrations or protests. But this had actually then dropped between 2019 and 2021-23. Next, please. And then here, what this shows is not change the way the other charts show, but this is just giving a snapshot of what protest participation looked like in 2021, 2023 in all the countries that we cover. And as you can see, once again, a lot of variation. So we have Ethiopians where 1 in 4 citizens went out and protested over the past year. And in contrast, in Tanzania, it was only 2%. So quite a wide range on this measure of activism. Next, please. And then here is another finding that I wanted to highlight from the report, where it highlights the age gaps in protest participation. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the one measure where we find that young people are more likely to engage or participate than older folks. So what this is showing is the percentage point gap. So when we ask people aged 18 to 35 versus those who are older. So what this is showing that in Tunisia, for instance, which is at the top of our chart, young people gave protest participation rates at 17 percentage points higher than those who are older, whilst we see no differences in protest for a whole group of countries where you see it says 0, including Seychelles, Congo, Brazzaville, and Togo, where both age groups are equally likely to go and protest. Next, please. Okay, and now for our next set of questions that I mentioned. So the question of who participates. So we've already started to look at that a little bit with the age comparison for protest. Next, please. And so one of the key indicators of citizen engagement around the world is education. And so we looked at engagement rates between those with no formal education, which is in blue, versus those with post-secondary education. And as you can see, what we find is that those with no formal education are more likely to engage in terms of electoral participation, so voting and feeling close to a political party. But then this flips for some of the other measures that we looked at. For instance, for discussing politics and for contacting MPs, it's slightly more post-secondary as well. But as we can see, it's quite a mixed bag, and it shows the nuances, that it's not necessarily an easy, clear relationship between the two, that it really depends on the type of engagement. Next, please. On the other hand, when we look at the relationship between poverty and citizen engagement, we tend to find that those who live under high levels of lived poverty are more likely to engage. And you can see this most noticeably on indicators such as feeling close to a political party, attending community meetings, and joining others to raise an issue. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we looked at country-level relationships between engagement and a host of different types of potential explanations for participation. And this first chart shows the relationship that I previously showed you between economic conditions and participation, but this time it's at country level. And I'll just walk you through what this chart is showing because it's a little bit more technical. So what this is showing is the relationship, for instance, in this very left-hand panel between whether a respondent lives in an area that is connected to the electric grid, and 6 forms of engagement, starting with voting in the last election at the top, going down to participation and protests. So the direction of these lines, these bubbles, is showing whether it's positive, which is when it goes to the right, which means that the two tend to go together, or if it's negative. So for instance, for the first EA electricity, what it's showing us is that countries with high rates of EA electrification tend to have citizens that have lower engagement in voting and lower community attendance, lower levels of joining others to raise issues, and lower contact with local governments. So as I mentioned earlier, these charts are showing us that there is a negative relationship between socioeconomic conditions and participation. So countries that are well off tend to have lower engagement rates. Next, please. And then this shows us that we tend to have the opposite relationship when it comes to democratic performance. So once again, showing that at the country level, what we tend to find is that countries with higher rates of citizen satisfaction with democracy, for instance, or that where people feel that elections are free and fair, those are the countries that also tend to have higher rates of participation in voting and lower rates of participation in protests or demonstrations. So I've given a lot of information about African citizen engagement, but I wanted to also answer Bernard's question about how do Africans relate to other parts of the world. And luckily we're able to do this because Afrobarometer is part of a project called the Global Barometers that allows for comparisons across world regions. Next, please. So in this first chart, we're able to look at where Africans stand in terms of electoral participation compared to other world regions. So starting off with the left, that shows voting in the last elections. We have our averages, continental averages for Africa in orange, for Asia in green, Latin America in purple, and Middle East and North Africa in blue. And what we see is that Africans' electoral participation is comparable to Latin America. It's slightly lower than that in Asia, and it's higher than what we find in the Middle East and North Africa. And then if we move on to, previous slide. If we look at that key measure that I mentioned earlier that has been going down of feeling close to a political party, even though that's declined over time, it's still at higher levels in Africa than we find in Latin America and the Middle East, but it's lower than what we find in Asia. Next, please. And then we're also able to compare where Africans stand on different measures of collective action. So firstly, if we look at attendance in community meetings, we find that Africans are about twice as likely to attend these meetings than Latin Americans are. And then secondly, if we look at joining with others to raise an issue, we see that Africa is the leader, the world leader in this measure, where 42% of Africans did so, compared to less than 20% in the other 3 world regions. And then lastly, if we look at participation in protest or demonstration, Africans do so at similar levels to Asian citizens and those in Latin America, but about half as likely to protest as citizens in the Middle East and North Africa. So with that wraps up some of the highlights of our key findings in our main report, but I also want to introduce one of the key communications outputs and resource tools that we've also created to communicate what these highlights look like at country level, which is our country scorecards on citizen engagement. Next, please. So here we have the country scorecard on citizen engagement in Kenya. And Kenya is actually one of the countries that we highlight in the report due to the Gen Z protests that occurred in 2024. So as you can see, the scorecard presents a lot of the information that I mentioned earlier, but rather than being at continental level, it presents it at the country level so that we're able to see what's happening on the ground in each of our different countries. And since I mentioned the Gen Z protests, what we have here in this pie chart is showing the distribution of protest behavior in Kenya, which shows that 2/3 of Kenyans say that they would never participate in a protest. 28% said that they did not protest, but would if they had the chance, and 6% of citizens protested that year. Next, please. And then I'm also highlighting Senegal, which kind of shows that we do have these scorecards in both English and French. And Senegal was another country that we highlighted in our report. So as you can see, it presents the same information, but this time for Senegal, so that you can take a look at how all of this varies in all the different countries that we have. And with that, I would thank you for your attention, and I will just close off by tying everything together. So in conclusion, just to wrap up and to reiterate, our first key finding is that most Africans participate in multiple political and civic activities, so not just one. And this shows us that engagement is high across the continent in various ways, and it varies. And we also see that Africans demonstrate engagement at levels that compare favorably with citizens from other world regions. And then secondly, while we find that engagement in collective action has declined over the past decades, we also find that Africans are contacting their leaders at higher rates than before. So that's an area in which citizen engagement is growing. And then thirdly, contrary to theories and findings in the global north, we find that in Africa, economic need appears to encourage rather than discourage participation. And then lastly, political factors are also key in shaping engagement. We find that effective democratic performance and perceived government effectiveness to citizen needs are both associated with higher levels of engagement. So democracy fosters engagement, and so does leadership responsiveness. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much.
Wow. I enjoyed that. I don't know about you. Let's do it one more time for her. Rory. Wow. If you just tuned in, this is a hybrid event. We are unveiling the flagship Afrobarometer report and country scorecards on citizen engagement in Africa. And we just heard from a senior analyst at Afrobarometer, Rorisang Lekalake, taking us through a fascinating presentation. I would like to ask the team to get my seats ready for the panel, if that's possible. Wow, this was interesting because usually research findings are flat and boring. You made it very exciting. And you know, we're taught that journalists must strive to make the significant interesting and relevant. And I think you did that. So journalistically, that was great. That was really great. And picking so many possible stories, my mind is going in different directions because there's so many things to latch onto. But I would not go ahead of myself. That's why we have the panel. So I'm going to ask the panel to join. But I need their seats before they come. And thank you for the slide on comparing Africa to the other parts of the world. Very important. And your 4 conclusions are very strong indeed. The point around, you know, this idea that when poor people don't really want to engage, that's not necessarily true. I was fascinated that people respond more to traditional leaders and their local government people than they do to their members of parliament and their other duty bearers. What is interesting, though, is was there a difference? Because in Ghana, we're debating voting for our local assembly people on a partisan basis. It would be nice to see if, when I get into the data, I can disaggregate and say, for citizens that vote for these local leaders versus those who get them appointed, there's also questions around regional blocks. So there's this way in which we like to think we West Africans are different from East Africans than you South Africans. I don't know if they are. If we can get into the data and play with those, whether we can just sort of pick them out, or Anglophone versus Francophone and that type of thing. 4 and 5. If you want me to stand 4, if you want me to sit 5. So should I sit or should I stand? Yeah, so she has how many teachers we need. So like this is great. And I'd like to say lastly that in the build-up to our election in 2024, some of the media in Ghana used Afrobarometer a lot because the National Commission on Civic Education did a poll on elections, and the Afrobarometer was a very useful tool to compare and sort of check whether certain things said could be verified. And I remember doing a number of television shows around attitude of young people to political parties and elections, and some of the insights we got there help explain the election outcome. So this is not just high-level data. It's very granular for some of us who use it in our media work. Okay. I think there's something going on here. Are we okay? All right. So I'm going to call up my panel members, and we'll just jump straight into the questions. Hajia Ramatulai Uwuri is Minister for Technical and Higher Education, Sierra Leone. Let's put our hands together for her as she comes up. A few things about her: a distinguished academic researcher, currently serving as Sierra Leone's Minister for the 2 sectors I mentioned. Worked many years as a senior lecturer and a multidisciplinary researcher at the College of Medicine and Allied Health Sciences. So she will be quite fascinated by some of the findings here. So Hajia, thank you for being on the program. We're also very lucky to have the Chief Electoral Officer, EC of South Africa, Sai, right? Sai Momambolo. And he's done this for almost 20 years. Veteran in 8 elections since the advent of democracy in South Africa, and he's served as deputy electoral officer as well, done lots of things in different provinces. Thank you, sir, for being here. We're so grateful to have you. Now, yeah, of course. So I think Audrey Gajaku wears many hats. She's an academic, a scholar, but she also, we like to think she's a journalist. I don't know if she still considers herself one, but I've been reading her stuff, so she's a journalist by practice, but also teaches and trains journalists. She's also the board chair of CDD Ghana, and she's former dean of School of Information and Communication Studies. Audrey is just amazing. I mean, let's welcome Professor Audrey Gajaku. Everybody calls her Audrey. You know, everybody calls her Audrey in Ghana, so thank you, Audrey, for what you do. And certainly last but not least, we have, I like to think you are more youthful. I like to think, by maybe mistaking, political activist, writer, widely recognized as the unequivocal voice of Togo's pro-democracy movement. And since her teenage years, Farida Bemba Naburema has been fearlessly advocating for democracy and human rights in Togo. Currently serves as executive director of the Katutu. Sounds in my language like untying a knot. Katutu, is that what it means? Liberation, yeah, but Katutu, yes. So in Ebe is to untie. Wow, like that. All right. So what I'm going to do is simple. I'm going to do an opening round for everybody. What caught your attention? Maybe 2 minutes each. Then I'll zero in on your specific areas and ask you a few questions. And because you're from different countries as well, if I can get your country slide, if not, fine. I'll ask you one question about your country as a bonus at the end. But don't worry about that. That's if we have time. So I'll start with familiar territory. Audrey, what jumped at you as you heard her deliver so excellently? Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. I think it was the finding that had to do with the fact that people who are resource poor, people who are the least educated, are more participatory in our democratic processes. But before that, I need to congratulate Afrobarometer. Yes. Very interesting report.
Yeah, very, very, very nice.
And as I was reading it, I mean, as the presenter noted, it was important to zero in on citizens' participation, because I kind of always like the quote that says the most important office in a democracy is the office of citizen. So I thought we might, and also the fact that we want citizens to be citizens, not spectators, as our former president noted. But like I said, it surprised me because, and again, it was noted in the report, studies that we've been accustomed to reading suggest it would be otherwise, okay? Citizens who are more educated, who have more resources, have time to lobby, have time to participate in meetings, have time to send around petitions, organize and raise issues, etc., and certainly also vote, you know. But this trumps it. And I think that finding validates why Afrobarometer is important, because these things should be taken in context. How citizens participate in democracy can be very contextual, can be very culturally based. It also makes me want to prompt that scholars and activists need to drill down a little bit more about these findings, because what lies, well, as you noted, I'm not surprised that traditional leaders are consulted, because, you know, we have a lot of rural communities where traditional leaders are the ones who dispense justice, are the ones they go to for all kinds of things. So it also suggests to us that we need to pay attention to traditional leaders and how they themselves operate within our democratic dispensations, because they are not always democratic. But also, I wonder what we might find if we drill down about the cultures of patronage in our political dispensation, and also the fact that people, of course it's need-driven, but there may be other things happening as well.
Yes.
I have 2 minutes, I'll stop here.
No, I was just going to validate what you were saying. That the first thought I had was that this issue of people who are economic need, it could be that they have to engage the political system because of patronage, but we don't want to jump ahead of ourselves. Maybe there'll be an inquiry line later, but it definitely requires further. Thank you, Audrey, for your first-time thoughts. Commissioner, can I call you Commissioner?
No, thank you very much, Program Director, and it's such a pleasure to be here this morning in Accra, Ghana. But the preliminary point I want to make is as follows: that the Afrobarometer has to be loaded for the cumulative scholarship that they've created over an extended period of time. I think the body of knowledge that you've created, it's a continental resource of no comparison, and that has to be acknowledged. The first issue that arises for me from the study is the very high level of reported turnout at 72%. Even though there's been a 5% drop over time, it's still quite high. Related to that is the fact that the continent is saying to us, quality elections matter, because the propensity to participate in election is partially dependent on how well elections are delivered. Now that has implications for the institutional and operational efficacy of election management bodies, and the type of public investment that must be made into election management bodies so as to grow their institutional efficacy as well as their operational abilities. In other words, recruiting correctly skilled personnel, appropriate ICT systems, and levels of appropriate transparency, working with stakeholders, and so on. So it's a very of strategic importance to the sustenance of democracy on the continent. The third issue, which is a bit worrisome, is the fact that 51% of the continent says that once elected, those in institutions of representations are unlikely to represent the views of the elected. So that incongruence between high levels of repeated turnout on the one hand, just opposed to 51% saying their views are unlikely to be represented, it's a big concern for democracy going forward. Because it means the electoral efficacy reduces. And once electoral efficacy reduces, the likelihood of continued participation recedes. So it's a danger that has to be attended to. So those who are playing roles in institutions of representation have to be alive to this incongruency, which is quite problematic. But related to this are questions about the general loss of trust in political parties as well as institutions of representation. Because people feel that the level of performance in terms of the delivery of services is not up to what it ought to be, and as such affects the ability for continued participation. We can look at this, but I see that your mic is nearing your mouth.
So Audrey gave me 3.5 big points. You've given me 4 big points. So I don't even know if my questions are prepared. I can even go through, because there's so many things you are saying that require further questions. So I'll just be disciplined and stay with your first time thoughts. So let me take your first time thoughts as well, Farida.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. I would like to also thank the Afrobarometer team for the amazing work they're doing. One of the things that came through for me was the fact that it kind of like brings up the importance of having data, because data deconstructs a lot of misconceptions we have about citizen engagement in general. For example, for me, it came as a surprise that the poorer citizens are, the more engaged they are politically. It wasn't something that I was aware of. So we need to get to a point where we are progressing towards data-based policy making. And unfortunately, we are lacking that severely on the continent. There is also something that I kind of like, it's a little emotional because currently my country, Togo, is going through a lot politically. And in the midst of the issues that we are facing, because right here we see that election has been one of the key avenues for citizens to participate. And in the context of my country, last year the constitution was changed and we no longer have universal suffrage, so we no longer vote for our president. And when protests started in my country a couple of weeks ago, there was a comment that was made by a citizen of Côte d'Ivoire. It was in French, and the comment says, "L'Afrique est tellement en retard, mais le Togo est absent." And in English, it translates as, "Africa is so late, but Togo is absent." And as much as it is true, it is a bit painful for those of us who have seen what other nations are doing in terms of civic participation, in terms of reforms of political systems. And unfortunately, that information kind of like takes me back home and makes me wonder, how could we, with this data, try to improve things in my country? So it was a little emotional watching, actually looking at some of the facts that were in front of me, but we'll get to talk more about it.
Just tell your Ivorian friend not to be too confident, because from what we see, he may be in a bigger problem than you very soon, with all the disqualifications, and we're not even sure whether the current president is going to go for another bid. So you may have the last laugh. Yeah, you may. But thank you. I like this. Honorable Minister, your first-time thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning, Minister.
I want to start off by thanking the organizers of this very important discussion for inviting me to share my thoughts. I also want to thank the research team for the work that they have done. As you know, I am a former researcher, so this is really something that it's like taking me back to my former days. I have a 9-year-old son, and all he says to me, "Mama, since you've been a minister, all you do is write speeches, make speeches, and attend meetings." So I'd like to go back and confidently say to him, no, I was in Ghana to give my thoughts as a researcher, but also as a politician on something that is very, very important. Before I was appointed to serve by His Excellency to serve as the Minister of Technical and Higher Education, I was involved in mainly health system strengthening research. But I remember a year or so before I was appointed, I was part of a consortium, the Africa Citi Research Consortium. And I was asked to work on a research project looking at youth and capability development. What were the barriers to young people participating in political spaces, and what were the opportunities that affected their full development? And I remember being very annoyed, thinking there's another work package on health. Why was I not asked to work on the health work package? Because I'm a health systems researcher. Why am I being asked to work on youth and capability development? But during the course of that exercise, it gave me valuable insights into some of the barriers that young people face. And one thing that stood out of that exercise was that when it comes to political participation, they felt like they were being used as tools in the days and months leading up to election, but then after the election, they're just pushed to the side. So that stayed with me, amongst other things, and then I got appointed. I remember sitting there and thinking, God has a funny sense of humor. He had to, expose me to that environment to fully prepare me to serve as the minister. I say that because one of the key things, in addition to what the previous speakers have already spoke about how what is coming out clearly from this exercise, that in Africa, the need the economic need of the community drives participation, which is not the norm in other parts of the country, and also traditional structures being utilized. So that gives us an opportunity for us to integrate it formal and informal structures. But back to youth participation, what struck me from this exercise was that despite young people not being engaged fully in traditional exercises, there's something coming up in terms of technology and digital platforms that they utilize. And it's becoming very powerful using social media, young people. I always say that I have an open door policy. I always say that I was appointed to serve young people. If I don't have young people within my universities, I don't have universities and vocational training institutions. But I'm also very mindful that I will not be able to engage with all of them on a one-to-one basis. Not all of them can come physically into my office. So I do value that they choose social media platforms. When I got appointed, within a couple of weeks, I was added to 1 million WhatsApp groups. And on that platform, young people can reach out to me and I can engage with them. And I value that. So despite them not being involved in traditional structures, social media is something that is becoming very common, and that is something as a policymaker, as a politician, I do value. But just to err on the bit of caution, we're now living in artificial intelligence era. So how do we use information and education to help them to decipher from what is actually valid data and information as opposed to what is something that has been generated using artificial intelligence?
Wonderful. You actually led me to my first question. So I titled this question the demography question. The demography question. The fact that with the exception of activism, younger people tend to lag behind older people in all the three, whether it's voting, community organization, or even contacting leaders. Apart from activism, where young people tend to do that more, they lag behind. Should we be worried about that? I mean, we understand that it's easier to be an activist using digital channels. But if young people aren't interested in voting, aren't as interested in working together to solve a problem, or even contacting their leaders, I mean, maybe Farida, I'll start with you, right? Is that not a problem, or should we be a bit nuanced about that? Because that was a clear finding.
I feel targeted.
No, sorry.
Well, it is a pretty good question. But what I would like to say is that it is not so and so that young people are not interested in engaging in advocacy, engaging in politics. Most of the time, your young people are prevented from it, and young people are excluded from it. Usually when we talk about exclusion, generally people think it is about, imposing barriers and saying, you have no right to be in this space. But exclusion isn't just deliberate. It is about breaking some of the structures that are preventing young people to feel attracted to some of the spaces. And unfortunately, when it comes to the political space, we do have a generation of elders that do not make the effort to pull the young people into those spaces, do not create the space to invite young people into those conversations. So there must be more intentionality put into how we engage the youth. And once that is achieved, they will be interested in being involved. Actually, when you look at all the criteria, you mentioned that activism is the only sphere in which young people are technically leading. And activism tends to be the hardest, the most dangerous, and in some countries, even lethal. So if the young people are willing to take so much risk to defend their right, then they should also be willing to be involved in other spaces. But it is because there are too many barriers, and those need to be broken, and we also have to continue intentionally to educate the young people and bring them in.
Thank you. Any more thoughts on that? And also adding the fact that less educated and more rural folks are more politically and community engaged than their more educated urban cousins, in addition to the youth point. So anybody box that? Maybe start the Commissioner, Audrey, and then you.
Look, I think it would be very dangerous to characterize youth participation as being apathetic.
Yes.
They are not, the youth is not apathetic. The youth is calling for different structures and modes of participation.
Wonderful.
And current systems do not offer them that. We did some research in South Africa about the youth affinity to participate in elections. They indicate that they need to have more convenient ways of voter registration, for instance. They want more convenient ways of voter participation. And we know that they engage politically on social media. They don't go to community meetings. It's an archaic way from their vantage point. They debate and engage on social media. Similarly, they receive services from their smartphones and so on.
Yeah.
So they are calling for a move away from those traditional forms of participation to more newer forms of participation. And as democracies, we've not been able to offer them that.
Yeah. But Commissioner, not to cut you, but the fact that on the point of voting, older people tend to vote more, or at least are more inclined to say they would vote than younger people. In fact, in our study in Ghana, the people who said they were less likely to vote were the younger group, right? So I understand and agree on the aspect of engaging online and all of those, but do we not risk getting a situation where the vibrant younger people, because of all the challenges she's discussed, feel alienated and excluded from the process?
No, indeed. If we are unable to offer them renewed structures of participation and renewed modes of participation, they'll forever remain outside of the formal polity.
Yeah.
Hence, they resort to protest and so on. Now, to go to your second question that you posed, you see, need drives participation in Africa as against the global north. But there's a reason I want to postulate for that, and that is that appears to me to be informed by hope that people have in governance processes to change their lot. And the fact that people who are in need have no other options like those that have not. For instance, people whose lot is poor, they can't take their children to private schools. So public schools have to work for them.
Yeah.
They can't afford private healthcare.
Yeah.
So healthcare systems have to work for them. And their participation, therefore, it's intended to register a need for improved public services. And perhaps it's a research question that can be pursued in the future as to what drives that level of participation. So their only hope is a working government, a government that is able to deliver.
So we're dealing with youth, we're dealing with rural folk, we're dealing with less educated folk, we're dealing also with less economically well-to-do folk. So we're looking at groups, right? So Audrey, any other group we should be interested in, because I'm building blocks, right? Is there any other group that is an area of inquiry of interest for you? For example, women?
Of course, women.
Yeah.
You know, and we know that the issue of women in political participation is a fraught one. It's been studied. I mean, the report talked about the level of women's engagement versus men's, and it's lower. But I also think it's also tied to the level of women's representation in political office, which is a major problem. I think that besides notable examples in Rwanda, which has 61% women in their lower house, Senegal, South Africa, Namibia, Mozambique, Ethiopia, they've achieved, according to reports, 40% or higher of women's representation. But the rest of Africa is really lagging behind. There's very little parity. I mean, according to a 2024 report on women's representation in Africa, in parliaments, the average in Africa is 26%. It moved up just 1 percentage point from 2021, where it was 25%. And they estimate that unless something radical happens, I mean, at this rate, it will take us, 2100. How do you pronounce that?
2100.
2100 before we can achieve parity.
Yeah.
I mean, the giant of Africa, Nigeria, has only 4% of women in parliament. What does that say to us? In spite of the fact that Nigeria has very competent, very capable, very bold, very assertive women over there. In Ghana, we're supposed to be the beacon of democracy.
Yeah.
We hardly have 15% of women in parliament. So it is a problem, especially when you think that during Nkrumah's time, we had 10 women in parliament when there was 50-something members of parliament. So there really is a problem. And the problems are, we know, traditional attitudes and beliefs, and also the structures of that are formal structures of political participation.
Yeah.
I mean, in first past the post countries like Ghana, you're going to see that women don't fare very well when it comes to political representation.
Yeah.
When it comes to participation, we also know that, for example, women who are involved in public discourse on politics are seen as contravening social norms. I mean, so, and of course, political discussions tend to be quite querulous sometimes.
Yeah.
There's issues of violence, there's issues of women being attacked in cyberspace. So now a lot of political participation happens, as he noted, by young people in social media. But women in that space are sometimes also trolled and abused and all of that. So patriarchal attitudes. And if we want to address that, it has to be addressed on multiple levels.
Just wanted to be sure, was there a gender breakdown of the findings? Because I don't know if I paid attention throughout.
There was.
So, yeah.
And it showed women engagement is much lower than men,
So,
you know. And these are some of the reasons: the patriarchal societies in which we operate, the attitudes to women, and then the barriers. You know, women are still the primary caregivers, so they are burdened. So if you have to do they're juggling, you know, so you don't have time.
Just a quick question. Did the women lag behind on all four? You know, there's the if you can remind us, because it would be nice to know. On all four.
They did. I mean, women were. Am I correct?
On all four.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. You know, and but it's all a mix of all kinds of reasons. You know, if you're very busy and you have to juggle all of the societal expectations of you, you're not going to be able to necessarily go to community meetings, for example, if the political space is inhospitable. And I mean, and in fact, there have been reports that show that 80% of women that were interviewed from 50 countries said they had experienced some form of violence, from physical to MPs, I think, from physical to psychological and that sort of thing. Sexual harassment is also a problem. So there's a lot going on there that prevents women from participating and from engaging.
Last question on this round. You are a Minister for Education. Now, I really hope I'm not misreading the report when I say that more educated people tend to be less interested in political participation. Am I misreading the report, or that's correct? Am I correct? Generally? Sometimes, okay. but that's my challenge, right? We thought education is what makes people feel like, well, I'm fearless now, I belong, I can participate. So if it is even true in some countries that the more educated tend to be economically better well off, and therefore they don't want to participate, that's still an issue, right? Because education is not just about reading and writing, it's also about civics and knowing your role as a citizen, not a spectator. So if our more educated people tend to say, well, I don't really mind, let me just do what I have to do, that should be a problem for you as a Minister for Education. You are our education minister on the panel, right? So what are your thoughts on that? How concerning is it? And what opportunity does it offer to re-engage on civic participation?
Thank you very much. It definitely is a very interesting finding, and I think it is a research question on its own, as we heard from one of the previous speakers, for us to understand what are the driving forces of that, for us to better understand why is that the case and how we can use that to inform development of policies or approaches and so on to change that narrative. But I think also it's that sense of how can we use civic education as well as a platform to foster social cohesion. If what is being implied is the more educated I am, the more well-off I am, I don't really care what happens in terms of governance and political spaces because I'm well-off anyway, then how does that support? It does not support social cohesion. So it's that sense of how do we use civic education to create platforms where we can help to change that narrative. In Sierra Leone, what we have is a new Ministry of Information and Civic Education. And civic education, for me, it's not something that I deal with only at my sector. I deal with universities and vocational training schools. We have two ministries of education. We have basic and senior secondary and technical and higher education. And I always say that I build upon the foundation that has been made at basic and senior secondary. So civic education, as much as it is important for my space, it's equally important at foundational level, at basic and senior secondary level, to create that sense of social cohesion, that sense of development in a manner that leaves no one behind, a sense of knowing that your voice, even if you have a voice, you should not only use it for your personal gain, but for a greater good. So having that Ministry of Civic Education has been quite useful for me personally.
Yeah.
What the minister has been doing since he assumed office is that every Tuesday there is a press conference where he will bring different ministers, different heads of agencies, members of the community to talk about topical issues relating to what is happening in the country. And that, for me, I have greatly benefited from that. And we've taken that a step further. It's not just at national level. We're even doing that at districts level to create that platform where we could hear from citizens also at that level. Because we can have the best laid plans at national level, but how it's translated in practice is through the lens of societal norms. So we have to really get their voices and their views into the way we do things.
Wonderful. My last question is what I call the trends question. Because what makes Afrobarometer so unique is the decades of insight it gives. So I think the slides she showed, I think from 2010. So the political participation, election protest is trending down, generally. And then sort of community engagement, working together, contacting local government kind of thing is trending upwards. Again, I stand to be corrected, but that's what I saw. So that people are, from 2010, the curves basically trending down. But when it comes to things like contacting your local authority or your chief, the numbers are higher as we come closer to 2025. Is that correct? I need that premise before I ask the question. Am I correct? Asunka, correct? Good. So I like some thoughts on that. So what I'm trying to say is that there's also hope that even though the political system may not be appealing or rewarding, and therefore for a 2.5 decade period, a lower percentage of people are voting, lower percentage are protesting. more people seem to be interested in contacting their traditional leaders. More people seem to be contacting their local government officers. So what does that say about what we should be doing? All right? So it's not all negative, right? So something is working. So 37% are contacting their chiefs. A good percentage are contacting their local government official, which means the closer you are to the people, the better, correct? So maybe let me start with Electoral Commission man. What are your thoughts on those hard trends, the downward and the upward?
Look, what that tells us is that the sphere of local government is important because people can access local councillors, they can vindicate their rights and aspirations through their interaction with local representatives. Now, at the policy level, it does raise questions about the extent to which we devolve legal functions to the local sphere, given the fact that people interact with that sphere. That's number one. So in our decentralization frameworks, we've got to be alive to that fact and take appropriate levels of decentralization to the local sphere. Secondly, what tends to happen in African democracies is that we take our best politicians into the National Assembly, they become ministers and so on. But this means we've got to be taking the best skills we have to the local sphere of government so that they can champion community interaction and local development.
100%, I agree with you. Farida, any thoughts on that?
Actually, I would like to, I believe, based on my understanding of the data that was presented, contextualize things a little. The slope was actually going upwards towards 2014 to 2016, I believe, and then downward from 2019. And then the researcher actually did mention COVID as well, playing a role in the reduction of protests. But there is also something worse than COVID did. In many countries, especially the ones under authoritarian government, it provided an opportunity for government to completely ban protests. In my country, protests have been banned since 2020. And even press conferences have been banned in Togo since 2020.
Wow.
So the government took advantage of COVID to consolidate power, to completely erase the civic space that we have. Even political parties are banned from holding meetings in the name of sanitation. And COVID has ended more than 2 years ago, and political parties still are not allowed to convene. So we also need to pay attention to what governments are doing to attack the civic space. And there is a huge erosion of the civic space in many African countries, and a reinforcement of authoritarian practices across the continent. So it is not just a matter of citizens changing behaviors, but it's also a matter of governments deploying resources to silence citizens.
Wonderful. So we have two strong points. Let me ask my last question. What gives you hope, right? Because the report is great. We have 25 years of data, 52 countries, comparing across continents. Something there should make us optimistic, correct? So I'll start with you, Audrey.
Okay.
Your mic speaks.
Yeah, what gives me hope?
Yeah.
The data suggests that young people, protest culture is low. However, I draw hope from recent occurrences in terms of protest. In Senegal, for example, protest by young people meant that Macky Sall could not go for a third term. That gives me hope. In Kenya, the protests are still happening, unfortunately, but it gives me hope that when Gen Z protested, they did get the financial bill withdrawn. They got responsiveness. So I guess my point is little hope of responsiveness. In Ghana, young people protested just before the elections against Galamsey and stuff like that. They got arrested, spent a few weeks in jail. However, the government did not survive, well, was alternated. And young people take credit for making sure that that government was not returned into power. So that gives me hope. Another thing that gives me hope has to do with the gender front, the women's front. The fact that these days we're beginning to talk a little bit more about what it takes to get more women into the political space. And certain actions are being taken. In Sierra Leone, for example, and that resulted in more women in parliament in your last elections.
Yep.
Ghana has just passed an affirmative action law. The activists are really, going to be monitoring this law and pushing for its implementation. And I think that when we're able to have policies, legislations that address these problems, we're going to likely see change in the status quo.
Thank you, Audrey. And that's the last point from the minister. Anything else that makes you optimistic for the future?
Thank you very much. Despite all the challenges, for me, challenges opportunities for us to think differently, innovatively. What gives me hope is we are challenging harmful gender and societal norms. It may not be intentional, it may not be the what we set out to do, but we're doing so as we proceed. In Sierra Leone, using our example where we have more women now in leadership positions, and the GEWE Act, the Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Act, says minimum, amongst other things, minimum 30% female representation. And we're being very deliberate to ensure within the ministry to train young women that will take up these leadership roles in the future in historically male-dominated sectors. But for me, the fact that we have more women now in leadership roles is we are showing the young girls for them to reimagine what is possible. But it's not just the young girls. I often say that we talk about girls, but then there's another gender. I talk about my son a lot. I take him to spaces where there are women talking in leadership roles, not because I want to tag him along, but because I want him to be accustomed to seeing women in leadership positions, because we can empower the girl child, which is fine, but then they grow up to be empowered women who have to deal with boys who have grown up not being empowered, not being accustomed to dealing with women in leadership positions. So we have to ensure that we reimagine the future for both men and women and help us to do things through the inclusivity lens and also gender equality. So that gives me hope. In addition to having a generation now of young people who are fearless. For me, if a young person goes out into the street to protest, it's not because they want to create chaos. It's because they care about something. They're passionate about something, and they know that their voice matters, their collective voice matters. So it's only a matter of time, and we are listening to them. We are seeing them because we're seeing the positive effects of them going out to protest. So for me, that gives me hope that we have a generation of leaders now who are listening, and a generation of young people who are not afraid to speak up.
Wonderful. Let's put our hands together for the panel. Hajia Wuri, a minister. We have Farida, an activist. Sai Momombolo, who is the election head, and of course, Professor Odikajapo. We'll make time for a few questions, if there are any. Not, I think the panel can stay. I think there's a few questions I can take. Yes, sir. So, Mr. Dobevi, you are a journalist and what? A development practitioner. Can I have a mic for him, please? Or he's going to use this. Can I see behind anybody who wants to ask a question so I can manage this? 1, 2, 3. All right. So, Emma, then you have to use this one.
All right. Thank you very much. Following the presentation and looking at the slides and the data, I was fascinated by the fact that citizens feel or act more democratic than their elected leaders, because you see the reactions to the desire to get participation, to get involved in politics, to vote. And then if you look at the data on who is closer to the people, is traditional leaders. And then the people who are further from the citizens are the people that are actually elected by the citizens. the traditional leaders are not elected. And so the people feel much more comfortable getting closer to them, or the other way around, they feel more comfortable connecting to the people. And then you elect someone to go to parliament, and then you don't see him again. I have lived in many areas in Accra, in constituencies. I've never met my member of parliament. I'm a journalist. I can't even get my member of parliament to interview him. So he doesn't look for me. When I'm looking for him, I don't get him. So effectively, I think the citizens of Africa are more democratically inclined than the politicians who actively, present themselves to be elected. And so that's the problem. The people protest and go on the streets because they want systems to work. And the people they elect to make the systems work actually make the systems impossible to work. So how do we solve this problem?
That's a huge question. Thank you for asking it. Good luck to the panel on answering.
Thank you. Well, my question may actually be more for the actual Afrobarometers. And it also relates to that issue of traditional rulers. But I found myself interested also in the fact that people relate more to the traditional rulers than they do to their elected representatives. And I wondered, is that because they don't feel they have to bring anything like, I did vote for you, I did participate in your, they don't have to bring anything because they don't have any say in the emergence of the traditional ruler. Is that perhaps why they feel more comfortable going? And I just wonder whether the Afrobarometer interviewers asked them, why do you prefer going to your traditional ruler in whose emergence you have little or no say, compared to the person that you actually elected? And there may be some that you may not get have access to, but many of them, particularly at the more local level, they can be quite accessible. And the other question that I wanted to ask was that the voting figures for Nigeria that I come from consistently suggest a very low turnout. In fact, we always hear about voter apathy. Maybe 30% of the registered voters turn out to vote. And yet the figures from Afrobarometer suggest that there's actually a slightly higher level of engagement in the voting process. And I just wonder, is that because the voting register remains largely a work of fiction, or is it something else? And maybe the electoral chief electoral officer from South Africa, who may have a slightly better performance than we do in Nigeria, can also help on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Please take note. So there's one question generally for the research team, and then one for the panel. And Ima's question is for the panel as well. Let's take two more. Yes, there's Mike at the back now.
Hi, my name is Natasha. I have two questions. The first question is around voting patterns, and voting seems to be the only time citizens engage fully. How can we get citizens to engage across electoral cycles? Engaging during in between elections? What are the things that we can do to ensure they're sitting in committees, they're making decisions and contributing? And the second question is sort of indirectly tied to that. It is no surprise that educated Africans don't participate because oftentimes we assume that because we are educated, we are insulated from the political decisions that are made. And poorer people are affected directly. They're affected by the police who knock on their doors. How can we then get the middle class and upper middle class to see that politics is indeed personal, that you cannot privatize every decision in your life? So what are the things that we can do to ensure that more educated see the need and justification to participate politically and not leave it to others that they deem more responsible for that?
Thank you. I'd like to say that a lot of the questions also have answers in them in a way. So it's open. It can also be a comment, because I don't think we have enough time to answer all the questions, but we'll take note of some and make comments here and there. So I note Emmanuel's question generally around the fact that citizens are more democratic than the leaders they elect. And then the question, the two-in-one question on whether we made another line of inquiry around why people prefer to talk to their traditional leaders than their elected duty bearers. So I think that question goes to the presenter. And then the election, the voter turnout question from Nigeria, right? The fact that people seem more interested to vote, at least from the Afrobarometer, than what the official figures say in Nigeria. So you can speak for your cousin, the Electoral Commission chair in Nigeria. Maybe you can explain. And then Natasha's 2-in-1 on what we can do in terms of beyond voting, get people to participate across the chain. I think that's a good question for the panel. As is her second question as well, on the fact that educated people think that because they're educated, they're excluded, they can solve their problems. I think that's also a legitimate question for the panel. Because I don't want to mix things up, let's take this round of comments. Then I'll take the final round of questions. Is that a good plan? Then we're done. Good. So who's going to go first? Commissioner.
Okay, voter turnout. As I understood the report from the study, this is reported turnout. In other words, people saying, I voted in the last election. Now, that may be true. It may not be true as well. So, whereas voter turnout in real terms is people who came to a voting station and recorded their ballot. How can we get citizens to engage throughout? Obviously, the quality of a democracy doesn't depend solely on elections, but on the quality of engagement throughout. And mechanisms have to be created for those possibilities. Public participation mechanisms, planning forums, that involve represented people as well as the citizens, budgeting forums, and things like those. They have to be institutionalized into the governance culture of a country. Because if they are not institutionalized, then they are unlikely to happen. What I've also found is that even if they are institutionalized, but there are no consequences for members of parliament if they don't do them, then they never happen. So it is important that there is some measure of consequence to these types of engagements being available.
Thank you. Any more on the panel? Farida first and Audrey.
Not on the election, though.
No, of course, on other questions. Yes.
Okay. If you allow me, I would like to kind of like touch a bit on the question that was asked further to the presenter about the data that indicates that citizens tend to seek more support from traditional rulers than the elected official. I feel like while Afrobarometer did a great job with this report, there is one branch of government that kind of escaped scrutiny, which is the judiciary. For many of our societies, people go to traditional leaders mostly for access to justice, for litigation issues that members of parliament wouldn't have been able to solve in the first place because of our customs and because of the difficulty for citizens to access justice through the traditional route. So they tend to rely on the traditional rulers rather than the government judiciary system to be able to access justice. So that is one thing that we also need to disaggregate so that we don't flood the...
Thank you for that. Audrey, any thoughts?
Thank you. Yes, I think that we haven't mentioned the media in this discussion. We haven't had time to. But we know that we need information. Citizens need information in order to engage. And that's where the media comes in, the media lending itself as places where citizens can engage, can even raise issues that they have problems with. So the quality of our media, the strength of our media organizations, their resource bases, and I mean, it's not optimum right now. So that's a bit of a concern. Also, organizations like our National Commissions for Civic Education have a role to play, again, in providing information, in educating people. But what do we see in many countries? They have the least resources of all, organizations such as that. So we expect people to engage in the political process, but we don't capacitate those who will support them in their engagement.
Wonderful. Any thoughts from Minister before I come to Rory?
Thank you very much. So the question on citizens are more democratic than their elected leaders. I believe it's creating a platform where us as leaders can be held to account. We should be held accountable because we were put in those positions to serve. And it's changing that mindset. We often have this, I don't know how to put it. It's like we feel like sometimes our leaders are untouchable. They're so sacred, but actually they were there to serve. They were put in those positions to serve. So we should be held to be accountable to those who put us there to serve in those capacities. And just in general, I think there's also a need for us to develop systems for our citizens in a way. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's knowing who they are, the different members that makes up our community, and developing systems that will meet them where they are. If it's young people needing digital platforms, we do so. If others want traditional structures, we do so and use that in its entirety. The point about citizens being more engaged with traditional structures, using my experience of doing research, I remember being involved in a study looking at how we can strengthen community resilience to respond to health emergencies. And for that study, we worked purely with community structures, identifying the stakeholders at community level, understanding the power dynamics, ensuring that there was gender inclusivity, but then connecting the traditional leaders with the formal district health management team. Having platforms where we come together and say, right, this district is dealing with maternal mortality this month. It's a concern. We come up with uniform messaging for all the stakeholders ready in that space and say to the bike riders, okay, go back to your community and tell them this is the accurate message on how we can deal with maternal mortality. Young people, youth leaders, go back to your community. Religious leaders, go to your mosques, go to your churches. This is the message. The health sisters, how the DHMT staff, this is the message. So that supports uniformity in the messages that we were sending out. So that could also be replicated, because for me, if there's a sense of going to traditional structures, it shows that there's mistrust. And how do we address mistrust is creating that platform for continued dialogue, open and transparent dialogue, where all the relevant stakeholders are represented, their views are captured. You identify problems, you co-create the solutions, and you own them in terms of implementation.
Wonderful. Now, there's a last question to be answered. There's a Zoom question I'll add to that for you. It reads, when it comes to political and civic participation around the world, why is North Africa separated from the rest of African countries in the analysis? What criteria was used? This is from Ategeka, J-A-K. And then there's also another one. What caused the drop in the contact rate in countries like Uganda? Does the question make sense? Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think the first round of questions were very much answered by the panelists, but I suppose I can give a little bit more of a technical side of things. So, for example, unfortunately, we do not ask why people do or don't contact their traditional leaders. So we have to kind of guesstimate using what data we do have. And I think this is linked, as has been already mentioned, to geographic and social distance, perceived distance. So I do think that, for example, if we had a question asking, do you think that your traditional leader listens to the views of people like you, the way that we do with local government councillors and MPs, we'd find a similar relationship, that if you think that the leader will be responsive, the natural thing will be to contact them. And then when it comes to the voting rates, I think this is a challenge in survey research because we're asking people to self-report whether they participate. the Middle East and North Africa, there I was comparing across different organizations that do regional surveys. So for us, we also do surveys in North Africa, and we included those countries in our Africa-based region. So we do not separate that way. And then there was one more question on Uganda, and I will admit here I'm not a Uganda specialist, so unfortunately I don't think I can answer that specifically, but definitely something to look for to potentially our national partner would be able to.
Wonderful. So I advertise one more round, but if you're happy, I'm happy. Are you guys happy to close? Or is there a burning question that has to come? Okay, so they're happy. Wow, you guys are amazing. Put your hands together for the panel. Prof. Gadjeko, C. Mamabolo, Farida Naburema, and Hajia Ramatulai. Wow, this is amazing. Great analysis. All right, so we'll take a quick photo with the panel. We're not done yet. We have two very important things to do. Thank you for your forbearance. I hope you're enjoying the program already. Believe it or not, we are now going to unveil the report. Can you imagine? After slicing and dicing the report to pieces, we're going to unveil it. Asunka, you explain how this happens. So we are using an unveiled report. Oh, this is the... Yeah, we're unveiling the report. Wow, that's interesting. So, Amina, you have the onerous task of joining Joseph Asunka to unveil. And of course, you present the first copies. So I guess that makes sense, right? Am I supposed to join this photo? Oh, I'm fine. Okay, so take the first one. So we are going to unveil the much discussed report. And we're so happy to have Amina Oyagbola, our board chair, to be supported by Joseph Asunka, CEO of Afrobarometer, to do the unofficial unveiling of the 2025 report. Is this a good idea? Put your hands together for them. Yes. I think you'll come up here. But now you have to say something before you unveil.
Wow, it's really awesome. Is it still morning? Yes, good morning again, everyone. And thank you so much for being here. I hope you've enjoyed the beautiful presentation made by our fantastic analysts and methodologists. I like that title. Rory, thank you so much. And thank you very much also to the amazing panelists. Please give them another round of applause. And a round of applause to all of you for all your very insightful questions, and to Joe and team for putting this amazing report together. I just want to very quickly, borrow from the excellent comment from one of the panelists, Sai, who said, that this Africa Insight report is a continental resource of no comparison. I'm quoting you, Sai. Thank you very much. I think that media, please take that away. And, the flagship report that's been put together by Afrobarometer, which we're all very, very proud of, and it really is very insightful. You've been given a snapshot here, but please make time to read it. I've read every cover of that report, and it's just absolutely amazing, even though I say so myself. It's our own contribution to cutting through all the noise, providing credible, comparative, and compelling data that tells us not what we assume citizens think, but what they actually say. So on that note, Joe, let us do the honors by holding up the second edition of the Africa Insight Report by Afrobarometer, which is focused on citizen engagement. Thank you very much. And I'd like to, invite members of the board, our founders, to come up, and our chair emeritus. Prof, I didn't see you sneak in. Please come and join us on stage, you know, and let us take a photo with this report. Yeah, we'll go down. Thank you very much, moderator. That was so exciting.
So we'll take a photo. Please join them down for the. So we're talking. There's still a speech to be made at the end. So Mr. Felix Biga, be getting ready for the closing remarks. Yep. So this is the expanded one. Rory, please join. Hey, babe, hooray. All right. Okay. Yeah, no, let me just. Jay, is there food after this to eat here or to take home? To eat here. We just need to be sure. All right. To eat here. Okay. So the food is here. All right. So we are going to invite for the closing remarks the Chief Operating Officer for Afrobarometer, Mr. Felix Biga. Give him a big round of applause.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Wow. What a wonderful, wonderful event today. So I have the easier part of the work, which is to give closing remarks. I just wanted to highlight a few of my takeaways, if you don't mind, and I know time is far spent. But as I listened, particularly on youth engagement or disengagement, it looks like there's something to say about exclusion, and I think it's something that we need to really take home. On women representation and participation, remains low. And traditional beliefs and systems often work against these. Education, which is meant to enhance participation, often leads to people becoming apathetic, but then it means education should be refocused. I also picked one big thing on local governance. It appears that we should really be emphasizing local governance because that's where people are really engaging and put the most resources there. I also picked the repressive regimes are continuously eroding the civic space, making participation lower and lower. And so people would want to participate, but governments taking advantage of the pandemic and other emergency laws to erode the civic engagement and spaces, and this leads to mistrust. Well, distinguished guests, partners, colleagues and friends, as we bring this momentous occasion to an end, I want to express our sincerest gratitude to all of you, panelists, board members, and leadership for your support. The unveiling of the African Insights Report for 2025 is more than a release of a report. It's an invitation to engage with our work and with this very important product. Afrobarometer continues to do this work in the hope that we are all going to use the data and the analysis that we produce. And the theme for this year is really apt, because citizen engagement and citizen power. It resonates, and I think it should be urgent. And I also take the point of hope, because amidst some of the findings, there's still hope that things can improve. I believe that the report challenges us to listen more deeply and act more boldly. So I want to highlight a number of sort of next steps. We are going to launch a French version, and this is likely to happen in Senegal. The date will be announced. Often when we do this, it's all in English, and the Francophone audiences are often feeling excluded. So there will be a French version that will be launched. We're also going to do a lot of follow-up launches, mostly to global audiences, but also to the African Union. I'm just going to say something about a video that is going to show up soon, and it's on capacity building. But before that, I want to say a huge thank you to you all for being wonderful audiences. Your participation has been amazing today. The panel has been exciting, and our moderator has been really, really, really good. So we're going to show a little video of capacity building. And it's just furthering our commitment to the democratization of access to data and data analysis by Afrobarometer. we are building a capacity building library of videos, and these will make our basic analysis capacity building programs accessible to larger audiences. So you can log in online and go through some videos that will be tutoring you. And so I will want the team to play the video right now. All right. And by that, thank you all.
Video. Play. Wow.
Power of public opinion data at your fingertips. Afrobarometer's online data analysis tool, or ODA, puts the power of public opinion data at your fingertips. Whether you're a student, journalist, policymaker, or engaged citizen, the ODA makes it easy to explore, analyze, and visualize high-quality survey data from over 40 African countries. No advanced statistical training needed. We hope this tool will equip you to ask better questions, uncover meaningful trends, and amplify African voices in the conversations that matter most.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I'd like to encourage the team. A few years ago, Citi sponsored something for Citi and some media houses called the I'm Aware project. They gave us access to their database to play around on local governance and duty bearers and stuff. It was really, really good. Education, health, and that kind of thing. I think Afrobarometer, you've gotten to a stage where you should be opening up and saying, hey, journalists, this is your login code. This is how you can, because there's so many questions I want to find out, ask around, like how does Togo compare to Cote d'Ivoire, right? And like, it does, why is it even teasing her? Maybe they're even better, you know what I'm saying? So going forward, find a way of getting, there are journalists like Emmanuel Dubevi as well, who also train other journalists in using these tools. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to use this in a very meaningful way to guide the discourse. So beyond the launch, I want to encourage you, give us access, we shall not desecrate it. I speak on behalf of all journalists in Ghana. Emmanuel, am I correct? Wonderful. So let's put our hands together for Afrobarometer again. Really great work. Two important announcements. Lunch is served.